Hey, so my name's Liz Weaver, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar today. We're very excited about this webinar. The topic is Culture, Collaboration, and Choice, a Values Approach. And I'm with the Tamarack Institute. If we could go to the next slide, we always begin our webinars with a land acknowledgement. So if we go back one slide, thank you. So this is a way at Tamarack that we acknowledge the work that we are doing with Indigenous peoples across Canada, and also to acknowledge our commitment to the truth and reconciliation process in Canada. So we begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contribution and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792, which is an agreement between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the credit of the First Nations. And I love the idea of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, because those of us that are situated around the Great Lakes territories really benefit from that resource. It's what feeds our lands, it's what grows our grains and our grasses, it's what feeds the animals on those lands. And we all have a collective commitment to taking care of that land, and Indigenous peoples and these covenants remind us of that. So thank you very much for that. If we could go to the next slide. I'd like to kind of tell you a little bit about the technology we're using today. So we have you covered. We are recording this webinar, but we're also going to share with you the slides from the webinar. There will be a post-webinar email that will be sent out to you. So that'll have the slide deck, the link to the recording, and any other resources that we are going to be sharing during the course of the webinar, or that Russ and Luzette share. And I would also point you towards, and we'll include this in our post email, a link to the CoCreative resources, because they have a wonderful website full of great resources for you to also have access to. We will invite you during the course of the conversation to use the Q&A panel. And in the Q&A panel, which is in the Zoom platform, you can put your questions, or you can vote on other questions that other folks might have brought forward. And at the end of the session, we're going to open it up for questions and conversations, and we will bring those questions forward. And you can also use the chat link in the Zoom platform to connect with Isaac, my colleague, if you have any difficulties or if you require any technical support. So those are the technical considerations that we have in front of us today. And now I'd like to just briefly introduce my co-panelists who will be leading the majority of this this workshop and this webinar. And I'm really excited to be joined by both Russ and Luzette. And their colleague, Melissa. It is a really big pleasure. Tamarack has had a long-standing relationship with the folks at CoCreative, and we often will come together and have conversations about our shared and mutual work. And so this webinar is really born out of those conversations. But let me tell you a little bit more about Russ. So Russ helps people who don't know each other and often don't even like each other to solve complex problems together. His unique strength is in creating the conditions and frameworks that support efficient and meaningful collaboration across deep sectoral and cultural boundaries. He builds on the capacities of others to lead effective collaboration by speaking and teaching around the world on changing complex systems. And that's how I kind of met Russ in the first place. I heard him speak, and then I reached out to him, and from there our connections and relationships grew. Tell you a little bit about Luzette as well. Luzette works on social ecosystem activation and systems change through the design and oh my goodness, Luzette, I'm having a hard time with your introduction, but I'll start again. So Luzette works on social ecosystem activation and systems change through the design and facilitation of transformational learning processes. She works in the areas of human development, well-being, and awareness-based leadership development for change makers. And to some degree, I've just met Luzette recently, but even in the conversations that we had preparing for this webinar, I've got to know her, and I know that between Russ, Luzette, and all of us, we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. So I think what I'll do, Russ, is turn it over to you to kick us off with a story.
All right, thank you, Liz. There's a bit in here about co-creative. I'm going to skip that and get to the story, which, per the image on the screen, is about fish. And I'm sharing this story to set the context for what we're going to explore together. This story comes from David Foster Wallace, who's a novelist and writer. Has passed away since, but he shared this story at a commencement address to Kenyon College here in the States in 2005. By the way, the commencement address, many people think, is the greatest commencement address ever given. So, two young fish are swimming along in the water, and they're passed by an older fish, and as he's passing, the older fish turns to them and says, "Morning, kids. How's the water?" The two young fish swim a bit further, and one of them finally stops and looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" So in this webinar today, we're going to share with you and explore with you what the water is that we're all swimming in, regardless of the kind of work that we're doing. If we're collaborating together, if we're working on collective impact, if we're working on systems change, anything that we're doing, we're swimming in some shared water. And so we want to kind of step out of the water for a bit and look back at it and see what we're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Russ, for sharing that story. And thank you, Liz, for the introduction. And it's great to be here. Let's explore the water that we are all swimming in. And as in any system change process, let's start with ourselves in self-reflection. And so let's use a little bit of a time here to do an exercise that will help us identify some of the waters that we individually swim in. So it'd be great if you have a pen and paper handy so you can take some notes. And I'll read some words to you, which I will ask you to choose from, depending on your preference. And we're looking at the slide right now, but what I will invite you to do is, instead of looking at the slide, you can just close your eyes or have them a little bit away from the screen and bring your attention inwards to yourself while I read pairs of words, and you will just choose one of them and choose the one that you feel more attracted to, that you feel that you embody more most of the time, okay? So the first pair of words is activity and rest. Planning for the future and being present now. Thinking and doing. Doing it fast and doing it well. Work and home. Tradition and change. Visionary and practical. candor and diplomacy, confidence and humility, justice and mercy. And so I invite you to just notice, look at your preferences, and just start getting a sense of the ways that you prefer to be in, that perhaps you choose to learn or to know or to do things like. And this is kind of like a sense of the water that you're swimming in your own culture and preferred values. I'll give you some moment just to notice. What are my preferences? So with this self-reflection exercise, we really want to open up the conversation to our ways of being, of knowing, of doing. We know that our worldviews shape what we believe in, what we believe is true or false, good or bad. It really shapes our values, which ultimately shapes our behaviors. So they even shape what we see and what we don't see. And this is not about the color of our skin, but really these worldviews by which we define ourselves, even if we're not aware of that. And so these ways of knowing, being, and doing that we will be talking about are really present every moment. We're all literally swimming in them. They guide us minute by minute. And sometimes we don't even know which value is really ruling what we're doing. So they really show up at different levels in the systems, inside of ourselves, and at the global level. And so in this time together, we would really like to, our aim is to raise awareness about these worldviews, these ways, not necessarily really moving into action per se. However, we will share some examples that perhaps can give us some ideas as to how to bring some good models into action. And so with this, I will pass it to Russ, who will share with us some of our frameworks we want to share today.
Thank you, Luzette. I want to start by sharing, before we share some of the learning and results from a survey that we've done to understand these ways of knowing, being, and doing better, what led us to this. So co-creative is, I think, shameless in borrowing and leveraging other fields of knowledge. And there's an article on our website, if you're really into the kind of nerdy stuff in this work. It's called The Elephant of Complex Systems Change. And there we share things that we've used and leveraged and integrated into the work from 28 different fields. So we're kind of obsessive about learning. And one of the things we realized is that there used to be this idea that, oh, if we all just did design thinking, or we all just did systems thinking, or we all just did agile and lean or whatever, then we're going to fix all these complex problems. And we realized that each of those disciplines, each of those kind of frameworks and methodologies contributes something to the work, but alone, each of them are insufficient for the complexity of challenges we're facing together. And so one of the things we were noticing as we were advancing the work and integrating more of this learning from diverse fields was that supporting people to embrace other ways of knowing, being together, of doing the work, made the work better. It made the work more effective. We got better solutions. The collaboration was more resilient, and we were getting better results. So we got even more curious about this, and we realized there's something deeper happening here, and we wanted to understand that. And we were thinking about values and working at the values level, and we could share more about that. But we've kind of expanded the inquiry into these other ways of knowledge creation, of showing up and being together and relating to one another, and the ways that inform how we even do the work that we're doing together. And so that was really the driver for this inquiry. And so for me, my own journey, I was familiar with the work of Tema Okun on white supremacy culture. Judith Katz early on did work on white culture, but it was the framing of a person named Dr. Edwin Nichols on philosophical aspects of cultural difference that really kind of opened my eyes to what was happening. And basically what Dr. Nichols did starting back in the 70s is he looked at the axiologies, the epistemologies, et cetera, kind of around the world, the kind of meta ways of valuing and knowing and getting work done. And he was doing it in a way that really respected and appreciated and drew together from all those diverse kinds of philosophies, as he called it, because philosophy was the only term he could find that really embraced that full spectrum of culture and knowledge creation and all of that. And so, so much respect to Dr. Edwin Nichols, who's still speaking, still doing work. You can find terrific interviews with him. He's now in his 80s and he's still talking about the need to really draw from the wisdom and the diverse ways of knowing, being, and doing that our different kind of meta cultures around the world offer to us. So in this particular inquiry, we did a survey with folks who were leading collaborations and mostly what they were calling or thinking of as some form of systems change collaboration. We had 48 responses from folks around the world. You'll see some of the ways that people identified their ethnicity. About a quarter of the respondents identified as Indigenous persons. And we asked them, in each of these dimensions of cultural difference, which Luzette is going to walk through us with here, to choose the ones that were most interfering with effective collaboration. Because one of the ways of knowing, being, or doing was really dominant, and it was suppressing other ways of understanding, other ways of relating to one another, other ways of approaching the work. So we asked them to identify which of these are really, really most undermining your work in terms of that dominance and suppression dynamic. And then we said, what are the effects of that? How is it undermining the work? Because we really wanted to get to understanding the dynamics here and how it was actually interfering with people coming together and doing effective work. Again, whether that was using collective impact or some other frameworks. So as we go forward here, I'm going to invite you to, and you can do this on your web browser on your phone, or if you have facility with moving between windows on your computer, if you could browse to slido.com. This is a polling tool we're going to use. You'll be prompted for an event code, and the event code is Tamarack, appropriately enough. And there's a simple prompt there, which is which of these things that Luzette is about to share is showing up in collaborations or groups that you're a part of. So you'll see when you're there that you can contribute and you can see what others contributed. And if anything that others contributed resonates with you, you can upvote it. So we're going to use this as a way not just to gather kind of individual insights, but we're going to use it as a way to see what's emerging for us as a group. Is that?
Thank you, Russ. Super. So here we will be taking a look at different ways of knowing, being, and doing that are ultimately building blocks of any culture. The items highlighted in yellow that you will be seeing through the slides are actually 9 dimensions that were identified by the survey respondents as those that most undermine the effective collaboration because of the dominance of the dominant values here on the left. And also you will be noticing through the work that we will be reading, that most of the top 9 dimensions will have to do with our ways of knowing or making sense of the world, which is, how we generate knowledge and understanding. And so as we can see here as ways of knowing, the first one is either or thinking versus or and the subordinated values under both and thinking. So we have the dominant view either or thinking and the subordinated both and thinking. And the challenge with this is that when we have one dominant view here, the negative outcome is polarization and unproductive conflict, according to the respondents. And also, if we look at the second one here, when we focus on the parts and we focus on a reductionist way of knowing, we also, and we neglect the focus on the whole, we just go on the dominant way, we can see the fragmentation and the tragedy of the commons that we usually see happening in different places and communities. We also have here the present future orientation and the past and present orientation, which shows a negative outcome of lack of empathy and healing. We also have the standardizing, counting, and measuring, and the imagery, feeling, and spiritual experience. The dominance of the first one creates the negative result of limited and dehumanizing ways of knowing. And the next one is the linear cause and effect and the thinking in cycles. And here's when we can see where we become unable to really grasp the complexity and emergence that many collaborations have, and actually working with system change requires. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is about ways of organizing our work. And here, the 2 categories that were identified are the moving fast as the dominant value and the taking time as the subordinated value or way of working. The negative outcome that we're seeing here is overriding urgency and lack of reflection. And the next one is the getting to the right answer and the trying things out, which the negative outcome results in perfectionism and stuckness. The next one, please. Here we say ways of organizing ourselves. The category that was highlighted here is personal responsibility and the subordinated value of collective responsibility, which gives us a negative outcome of individualism and lack of care or empathy. And I'm going to give a little bit more of time here because we only have one category, and I would love for everyone to take a look at the other ones for a moment. Thank you. Can we see the next one? So this one is about ways of interacting. On the dominant values here, competition was highlighted as a big one, having that dominating to the neglect of cooperation, with a negative outcome of self-centeredness, fragmentation, isolation. And let's take some few more moments here to look at the rest. Thank you. Can we move to the next? This one is on values. And I'll leave you all to read it. So what is important to say also is that from all these different, each of the dimensions that we are seeing and the different ways, effective collaborations that actually embrace both ways over time really get to benefit of each side. So for example, there are times when we need to standardize, count, and measure in our work. And there are times when we need to engage more in a ritual or the feeling and the spiritual experience. And both of these ways of approaching our work provide real benefits. And when we use them together well, we make our work and our collaborations more effective. What it's also important to highlight is that negative outcomes tend to arise when we embrace only one dimension in each pair systematically over time to the neglect of the other dimension, as I pointed to the different categories. And each of these different preferences, cultural preferences, is not harmful on its own. The problem with it is the dominance. When, for example, we only measure and count versus to the neglect of just feeling and sensing and being more spiritual. And so what is really deeply harmful is the systematic dominance of these and basically largely white and Western ways and the associated systematic suppression of the non-white, non-Western ways. So this is usually a part of a dynamic that is based on dominant tendency to perceive these pairs as either or choices, rather than seeing them as interdependent polarities or actually ways and perspectives that helps us see a more complete perspective. So can you please see the next slide and see? This is an effect, an example that I would like to read. This comes from the survey. And we were asking about the embracing, standardizing, counting, measuring to the neglect of imagery, feeling, and spiritual experience. And participants responding and shared the following. We lose sight of the bigger picture culture shift. Not using imagery, feeling, and spiritual experience sucks the life out of the work. Solutions that perpetuate Western dominance. We only take into account the things that can be easily externalized and ignore the things that are vague, uncertain, and intangible. Integration of, understanding of, and heartfelt connection to the work is limited, affecting our ability to build trusting relationships with other collaborators. And we have here more examples of some of the negative outcomes that participants said would happen and have happened when there is a dominance of one particular view. And so it would be really great to see what's happening in Slido and see if people have had the time to share.
There's been a big conversation going on in Slido, and folks have been, as you've been going through the various elements, Luzette, people have been writing down what has resonated with them. And what I really like is this example that you provided. You know, at Tamarack, we have this saying, no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers, right? As we think about evaluative work. And so it is kind of trying to balance the dominant with the subordinate approach. And so it's a really nice way of kind of bringing the two together. Russ, what are you seeing on Slido? Oh, you're on mute.
We've started to see some things kind of rise to the top, and a little bit different than what we heard from the survey respondents, but some are very consistent. Focus on the parts, right? We're trying to do whole systems work. We're trying to understand all the root causes, the upstream determinants of the social and environmental outcomes that we're seeing. And yet there's still this tendency to try to break things down and just understand kind of piecemeal, bit by bit, what's happening. And that was named by the survey respondents too. So clearly resonating with the group here. Recording in the written word and ignoring other ways of communicating, understanding, and dialogue didn't come up as high with the survey respondents, but we have particularly seen this in collaborations involving, say, state actors and Western actors and indigenous communities. In fact, our colleague Heather Equinas, in some work with the Tribal Marine Stewards Network, talks specifically about this. The state actors, in this case, the state of California here in the States, they wanted everything written down. Everything had to be documented, and every agreement had to be, you know, kind of in writing and thoroughly documented in all the best legalese. And the tribal leaders were not into that. And so there came to, well, there are certain things we want to write down, we need to write down, you know, to document for the public to comment on, et cetera. And let's have the spoken word and our dialogue be the main way we're making meaning and doing work together.
Russ, and I also would like, sorry, Liz, just a comment here, and is even as I present this data, this is actually personal. It has been such a journey for me to be able to speak concisely, precisely, measure in bullet points, and it is not who I am. It really, I get nervous. I go, and I'm like, don't go in circles. You have to, right? And it's, how does that serve us if we cannot be, you know, our own selves and present our wholeness and our truth? And can we be seen as that in our collaborations?
That's a lovely point that you just made, Luzette. And I think, you know, the point I was going to add to yours, Russ, is, you know, what we're seeing emerge a lot in the sector are these kind of graphic facilitators that are supporting the work, right? So that we have not only the written, but what's the imagery that we're pulling forward in this work. And, you know, one of the tools that we use at Tamarack a lot is a plan on a page tool. And it's really not only what the group wants to do, but what's the imagery. We often ask communities to identify what are some anchor images that will tell the story of your community in this plan, right? And that whole conversation about what they value and what images speak to them is a really interesting one, because you get some new insights into community. So yeah, I love the notion of imagery.
So we're seeing focus on the written word again, getting to the right answer. Someone said, and self-protection. Tema Oken refers to self-protection in her paper on white supremacy culture as the right to comfort. I have a right to be comfortable and not to have, you know, my ways of thinking or even what I say be challenged. And then that getting to the right answer, boy, if there's any enemy of effective systems change work, it's this idea that there is a right answer. And once we find it, it's going to unlock everything and everything's going to work better, right? So yeah, a couple of people noted in the survey, they said, you know, this particular dimension is kind of key to everything else. A number of people said either or thinking, because if you're thinking of any of these 29 dimensions as being either or propositions, then you're stuck right at the start. Someone else interestingly said the materialism and spirituality dimension they thought was foundational. That our disconnection from kind of the spiritual experience, the spiritual aspect of our lives to greater purpose, etc., was actually undermining all those other dimensions. So interesting, people have different theories here about kind of among all these dimensions, which ones are really root, right?
It's really interesting to kind of consider how they interplay and where we land on them. It's almost like, you know, where they were they a kind of a scale, right? And so do we have a preference in one area or another, and what are the things that we could be doing to bring ourselves more intentionally into the subordinate area, or, you know, what's preventing us from doing that? What's preventing our collaborative or our group or our team from doing that?
Yeah, and so you mentioned when we were talking about this webinar, Liz, the Johari window. And you know, a group doesn't know what it doesn't know. And if I'm not aware of something and no one else is in my group is aware of another possibility, then we are all collectively, we're all swimming in the same water, right? And that's why in any of this kind of work, diversity is key. Not just diversity, like having diverse experiences and perspectives and ways of knowing, being, and doing in the room, but inclusion, which is really enabling all that diversity to show up in its fullness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it is kind of thinking about, you know, how we embrace that, but also recognizing that sometimes a dominant culture will show up, or a dominant value will show up. And so how do we, you know, when we are entering into different levels of conversation with, you know, folks that have different experiences, how do we create the space for those to, you know, make us uncomfortable, but also still within that comfort, right? And it's that kind of challenge in all of this, I think. Hey, so we have a couple of questions that we've thought about, but we also have a question in the question and answer box. So are we ready to go to questions, or, okay, perfect. So why don't I bring up the first question in the question and answer box, and for others, please, if you have additional questions, put them into the Q&A box. And so we've got some time in the webinar to ask Luzette and Russ a little bit more about their work and their research and what's next for them. But the question that I have is from Sue. And Sue says, how does your dominant cultural value impact your ability to be a leader and or demonstrate leadership? And do you shift your values to become more leaderful? So I don't know if we start with you, Luzette, and then we'll have Russ weigh in. How's that sound?
That's good.
Maybe we could stop sharing. We do have more we could share in the deck, but if we could stop sharing it for now.
Okay.
Great. This is a great question. And I wouldn't have the only truth, of course, but the way that I've been working on it, we have been working, is really identifying our ways of leading, being, doing, and to know that we will need a different way at different times, and that we really need to embrace and create spaces where people can express their own ways. And so in spaces, for example, we've introduced check-ins to know where people are coming from, where they are, maybe even with some questions that allows us to understand their point of view, where they're looking from, right? And so I don't think that I need to change my values as a leader, but I do think that I'm invited to be open, to hold multiple perspectives and create architecture in the way that we hold meetings, in the way that we set up partnerships that are diverse enough to have different voices, but not only to have those diverse voices to just fit in what we want to see, but to really disrupt and create and co-create together. So there is a space from my side where, and for everyone in this type of collaboration, where we really need to step into the discomfort of kind of like be willing to be changed by what we hear from others, and be able to generate something that we never expected we could.
That's really lovely. Russ, anything that you want to weigh in here?
I think a critical function of effective leaders is intentionally bringing the difference that the group is missing. So let's say I have a team, I don't, but let's say I did have a team that's constantly rushing to action and not really thinking things through, not being reflective, maybe not planning, etc. Then it's incumbent on me as a leader when I see that to bring that difference, to say, hey team, let's slow down, let's plan a bit more, etc. And I think it's true of these dimensions too. You know, I see us working in very kind of rational, reductionist, methodical ways. Maybe I intentionally, and maybe I can't bring it myself. Maybe I need, you know, someone else who can presence that in the group. But I might disrupt that in some way because I see the costs that we're incurring in our team or in our collaboration. And so, of course, I have to be aware that we're swimming in that water in the first place, because if I'm a leader and I have a bias toward action, just like my team, then more likely than not, I will be in confluence with my team. Because I love that. I love action. I love getting right to the, you know, let's implement whatever. And so the journey with a group is you can't separate it from individual journeys of awareness.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I often am, you know, thinking about, you know, people will talk about collective impact experiences and they'll say, okay, so how do we do this? And my first answer is, well, it depends, right? It depends on your context. It depends on the complexity of the issue. It depends on the readiness of the community. It depends on who you have around the table. So, you know, I see it as a set of simple rules, but not a recipe, right? And I think it's how do we enter into these spaces in the work that we're doing, and to really be mindful of what our own preferences are, which is what you're saying, right? What are our own preferences, or our own inclinations, and to either invite the other in or bring forward people who have the capacity to take us in a new conversation, in a new way of thinking, in a new way of working and being. So I'm going to bring up one more question, and I can see people are voting on them and other people are putting questions together, but this is from Kim. And Kim writes, what strategies can be employed to open up the space for conversations about values inside an organization that helps them discover, oh, Kim, your question just went down, that helps discover how each person is interpreting things. So what's the process about that? Because, you know, sometimes we have as an organization a set of values that we articulate on our website and on our strategic plans and all those other kinds of things that we do. We even have that in our collaborative groups, but how do we open up the space? So Luzette, let's start with you again.
Sure. It depends. It depends the group you are with, the collaboration, the organization. I don't think that there is a recipe, and it will be at different levels. So my inclination is so there is the collective and the individual, and obviously there are overlaps, but we always need to look at and I like to do this at the individual level, looking at the mental models that we hold as individuals and the emotions that we connect with that. So there's a lot of personal development that needs to play a role. So a lot of the work I've done is actually igniting and cultivated coaching opportunities, or just personal development opportunities for leaders and participants of collaborations that really open up their mindsets. And then there is also this other part that reconnects with culture, which is what we're really speaking about, and having conversations about this, actually having teams saying, you know, what are our values? I actually like to do self-assessments for individual team members, and then the team come together and look at what is happening for everyone, and how are people's points of view and perspectives and views. And then organization, and then you have the organization level. And that's when we really need to open up to have difficult conversations and check in and say, you know, how are we doing? How are we doing as an organization? And what are pain points and why it's actually working? And so I would say that conversations is key. And something that happens, and Ross has taught me this a lot, is they need to bring diversity, because one of the blind spots and you know, tricky parts of this is that sometimes we do have these conversations, but we don't realize that we're all talking about the same thing, because we are the same. We're all trying to fit in one thing, rather than really allow for new perspectives to come in. And so being intentional about bringing courage into the conversations and bringing difference is key.
What about you, Russ? What advice might you have here?
I would start with diversity, diversity, diversity. And in order to make that work, we need shared agreements, we need shared intent, we need to share information and analysis, right? There's so many things that go into making diversity work. And to get to alignment around our goals, around our intent, we need to allow divergence, like genuine divergence. And I think often collaborations don't allow enough space for real divergence to happen within the context of we have a shared goal, we have a shared intent, we are moving in the same direction, we share a vision of where we would like our community to be, those kinds of things. But the other, I think, is kind of the methods are around what I would call dialogic meaning making, and you could learn more about this at the Bush Marshak Institute. So we'll put a link to that in the follow-up. But they've been leaders in this field of what's called dialogic organization development, as opposed to diagnostic, because it used to be you would hire an organization development person, they would come in and they would use some diagnostic tool, they would make recommendations, and then it wouldn't work. And dialogic organization development, or a dialogic as approach, is getting at how are we really making meaning. And so, for example, when I was supporting a leadership team for a collective impact initiative here in the States, there was a big conflict that emerged really quickly. And I won't go into the backstory because I don't want to identify the group. But it ended up with me and this leadership team one rainy evening in a really small conference room talking through this conflict. And people were using the word equity. And I noticed that the more people talked about equity, the more one of the leaders sat back from the table and crossed his arms and stopped making eye contact with other people in the room. So I said, group, stop. Let's go around now, and I want to hear from each of you. When you hear the word equity, what does that mean to you? So we started with the guy next to me. He said something that was along the lines of fairness and recognizing, you know, structural disparities and et cetera. We got to the funder, who had a textbook definition of equity, like right out of the equity playbook. And we get to this guy I was referring to. He uncrosses his arms and he leans forward and he said, you know, because I trust you all and I respect you, I'm going to be honest with you. When I hear the word equity, I hear people taking without giving back. And that was a breakthrough moment for that group, because practically what this guy had been doing for a year and a half, anyone would call equity work. But the politicization of that kind of individualistic, you know, this like people are taking from other people in the United States, that some people are living off the largesse of other people, other citizens. That had so colored his perspective on this term. Every time we were using it, he was feeling more and more disconnection and polarization. And so I said, wait, okay, that's helpful. So you're hearing equity as people taking without giving back. When the rest of you are using that term, is that what you're talking about? And they were like, no. right? We need to foster personal responsibility and accountability, as well as providing services and support to people. And so there was a deeper level of meaning making there that then allowed them to go together with a fuller kind of shared picture of what they meant by equity. So for example, when people ask questions, sometimes the leader just answers the question. I encourage leaders to first say, can you tell me what prompted that question and what, you know, what your interest is behind that question? So we're getting to the meaning. We're not just kind of transactionally talking about the work.
I think that's yeah, it's such an important story that you just told about the meaning and the shared sense making that we have around these kind of moments with around tables and with collaborative groups, and how you know, how we can play a leaderful role or become more leaderful by creating that space and going deeper into equity. You know, there's an organization I know, you know, Russ and Luzette as well, called Human Systems Dynamics, and they talk about standing in inquiry, right? Which is really someone poses, you know, a question, and what the practice is with that group is that they, rather than answer the question, they invite everybody else to ask questions that hopefully create the space for further clarity around that question, or for further depth around that question, right? It might be kind of like the 9 whys or the 5 whys that they use in kind of other systems. But I find that so interesting, because every time I've participated in a process like that, where we've just stood in inquiry rather than getting to an answer, the question becomes deeper and more relevant, and our shared understanding of that question is richer as a result, right? And takes us in different directions. So, you know, I know we don't practice that very much, but it's such a powerful practice to be able to, you know, say, here's what I'm struggling with, and then what are the questions that you will provide me so that I can even think more deeply about the question that I'm struggling with, or the challenge that I'm facing right now. So yeah, I think it's a really important and leaderful practice. Luzette, I see you're kind of wanting to jump in. So before I go to that other question, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I mean, it's just because something you said really prompted me, and it's when we were talking about the subordinated ways, actually bringing them kind of like in an equal level with the dominant ways is a way to do this. Like if we're talking about, for example, adding rituals into some of our collaboration meetings, if we're adding, you know, more a space to reflect rather than just do, if we have more space to sense what wants to emerge rather than just plan and control, but right? And we create the space in our collaborations, that really makes a difference.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I want to point to a tool that CoCreative uses a lot, and maybe Melissa, you're anticipating this, but it is, you call it Calm now, but I think about it as the 4 agendas tool, because I think the 4 agendas tool for me, which is one of the tools I point to all the time, really helps us have much more of that intentionality about creating the space in an agenda, in the forming of an agenda, to have some of the aligning, have some of the connections, have some of the learning and sense making, and also have some of the kind of decision processes that we have to have as part of this work. And so it's one of my favorite tools of yours, and one I point to regularly. But I think you're right. I think it's about then also bringing some of those subordinate values to the forefront and saying it with the intentionality that we're going to bring these into the process. Do we have time? I think we have time for one more question from the group, and I'm going to go to an anonymous attendee for their question. So this is what the anonymous attendee has asked. How do dominant cultural values show up differently for an individual depending on context? And is it important to consider when collaborating in groups? For example, someone may show up differently in certain environments. So, Luzette.
Actually, what this question made me think of is actually trauma. Like sometimes we have our dominant way. The dominant ways we share are the ones that really are dominating every way that we do collaborations in the Western world, at least now from my experience. And so what has happened and what I have seen is that because we leave the subordinated ways to our own neglect, we don't take into consideration other ways of being and learning and expressing. Sometimes even people, particularly, for example, with trauma, come into these conversations to collaborate, to create a solution in their community, for example, and cannot fit in the language we are using, in the metrics we want to share. They even in the questions we ask them in communities. I've experienced this working with small farmers in Mexico. I experienced this working with members of gangs in low-income populations. And you ask questions and they don't even understand what I'm trying to ask, because I am so not meeting the reality of the thing. And so and if people have had trauma and I'm talking about the future and I'm jumping on the healing that needs to take place from their past, then I'm not going anywhere. I'm just creating solutions that look in paper and in my Excel sheet, but not necessarily really transforming the system I want to change.
Thank you so much for that, Luzette. Russ, anything that you want to add here?
I think in the kinds of collaborations many of us work with, collective impact initiatives, for example, it's a question of how do we create the conditions that really allow people to show up as their whole selves? And that's really what the 4 agendas are about, in a way, right? Each of the agendas relates to head, heart, hands, and spirit, in a way. But we did a training course last fall. We had about 60 people from New Zealand. And so we had colleagues from New Zealand open each session in the course with a karakia and close with a karakia, kind of a sharing, kind of like a prayer, but a sharing of traditional Maori wisdom. And everyone loved it. Didn't matter if they had never heard a karakia, if they were Maori or not, or whatever. There was this grounding, this connecting, and even a kind of transcendent quality that was brought to the sessions that we couldn't have gotten in any other way. But it was the genuine sharing of this kind of cultural wisdom and richness that everyone loved. And so I think the thing about this, you could look at what we covered here today and say, well, this is about being fair or inclusive, or it's the right thing to do, or it's whatever. Everyone benefits from integrating these ways of knowing, being, and doing, particularly the people who are steeped in dominant culture.
So thank you so much to both of you, and to Melissa for posting tons of additional resources in the chat box. I know we didn't get to some of your questions, and I know we didn't get to all the slides, but you will get the whole deck, and we will be inviting Luzette and Russ back. I really think, for this call, both of you really showed up with your whole selves, and you were both present, but also really reflective in what you shared with the group. And so I really appreciate that, and continue to value the relationship that Tamarack has with CoCreative and all the fine work that you do. Everybody on the call, thank you for joining us. I know we're just at time now. In a couple of days, you'll get a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint, and also the other resources that we have. And so thank you so much for engaging with us on Slido and through the chat box, and by putting your questions forward. We really appreciate your time. We have a number of other webinars coming up, so please visit tamarackcommunity.ca to find out about those other webinars and also other workshops. Next week, Tamarack's hosting a 3-day conference called 2 Days will be focused on the end of poverty. So if you're working on poverty reduction in your community, we invite you to look at that conference. Or if you're working on Youth Futures, we have 2 days on, it's an overlapping conference, which is going to be interesting, all virtual. So you can either join us for the part about poverty or join us for the part about building youth futures. And so thanks everybody for joining us. And again, Russ and Luzette and Melissa, thank you so much for your sharing your thoughts and perspectives. And I also want to do a special shout out to my colleague, Isaac. This is his first time supporting a webinar. And so, hey, Isaac, thanks for jumping in at the last minute. We really appreciate you as well. So thanks so much, everybody.